Hello, everyone, and good afternoon. I'm Isabelle Roughol from the New Humanitarian. Welcome to this live stream. Welcome if you're joining us on LinkedIn, if you're joining us on YouTube, and welcome to Irwin Loy. Hey, Irwin.
Hi, Isabel.
So, Irwin is our policy editor at the New Humanitarian and astute observer of the aid industry. And joining us today to talk about the money in humanitarian aid. Where's the money? So, I asked Irwin to come on for this live stream because of some reporting he's done recently that's just brought this story back to the forefront. And so, as a way into the topic, Irwin, I wondered if you could explain to us what's been happening with the ICRC, the International Committee of the Red Cross and the Red Crescent.
Sure. Well, the ICRC has been in the news recently because their Director General a few weeks ago announced that the ICRC is facing a budget crunch, funding shortfalls of 25% of their budget this year. And that's just a few weeks after they approved their budget for this year. And it looks like there'll be a lot of cuts coming. And so the story we did a couple of weeks ago was just pointing out some of the internal debate over those cuts, and that's really increased over the last few weeks since Mardini sent his message earlier in March. There's a lot of anger from ICRC staff, sort of accusations of financial mismanagement, and from the ICRC's point of view, officially what they're saying is that it's a product of the wider funding issues throughout the humanitarian sector, and that's certainly that is true. Everyone is facing a budget crunch, but there are, as the staff point out, who wrote some 2,500 staff members signed an open letter addressed to Bardini, basically calling for an audit of the way finances are managed. And there are other issues at play, which go to how ICRC plans its budget and manages it, which is a bit different from perhaps others in the aid sector. But I think it's a jumping off point to talk about the finances, about the funding crunches that the aid sector is facing. Mardini is right in that everyone is donor funds aren't keeping up with really what's happening in terms of humanitarian needs, which are obviously rising with COVID and with climate change so really, I think this is an issue that everyone's facing. It's just quite acute at the moment at the ICRC.
And we'll get into all those, more structural conditions in the industry. When you're talking about a 25% shortfall, that's off of a $3 billion budget, I believe. So what does that mean concretely on the ground in terms of things that, programs that should have happened that aren't happening? Do we know, practically what this is going to mean?
Publicly, not yet. The ICRC is not saying what specifically will be cut. Internally, heads of delegations have been, the delegations in each country where the ICRC operates, have been told to suggest or to make these cuts, or to suggest the cuts, and then the directorate will apparently decide what will be and will not be cut. And internally within each area of focus within each country, there have been little leaks here and there about what's coming up, and so there's a lot of concern, obviously, from people within the organization. The ICRC is, in theory, they're still saying that they're going to keep asking for the original budget, but it's clear that donors have essentially told them that they're not going to get everything that has been promised, so that's why they are kind of making these plans. So publicly, it's not yet clear what exactly will be cut, but I think individuals within the ICRC have a better idea, and there are some within certain regions. I think everyone's sort of adding things up, trying to figure out what's up with their job, what it means for people in crises, because at the end of the day, it will have an effect for people in crises. And obviously that's where we come in with our reporting. And So that's a big concern for everyone, obviously, within the ICRC right now.
Absolutely. And so hello again to everyone who's joining. And actually, to your point, Erwin, we have people saying where they're coming from in the comments. We have people from Pakistan, Nigeria, Burkina Faso, Ukraine. These are all countries that where response to particular crises is going to be impacted. And so talking about the broader context, as you mentioned, of funding woes for humanitarian aid in general, I think there's always two sides, right? There's the need, there's the demand and the supply in a way. So starting with the need, it seems like it's ballooning. The UN global appeal is going up every year, which is kind of the number the UN puts out every year to say, this is how much money we need to address humanitarian need in the world right now. So can you speak a little bit to why that is that need seems to be going up and up?
I think it's a range of factors, just, more intense conflicts. You have COVID over the last few years, obviously, which has just really removed a lot of communities' ability to cope. You have the global financial situation right now. You have rising inflation, which is added to the pure cost. And you have climate change, obviously, just driving more frequent and more volatile disasters, at least, and making them a bit more unpredictable, and really adding fuel to the fire in existing crises. You have, food insecurity across the globe is maybe as bad as people have seen, at least since they've been trying to measure food insecurity. You have, this range, all these factors. There's also, in terms of, when we're talking about the UN's budget, their yearly appeals, billions and billions of dollars. It's also the scope of what humanitarian aid right now is as big as it's ever been. By definition, humanitarian aid is emergency aid. That's aid of last resort when all else has failed. And I think it used to be that when you're responding to a crisis, that was what the humanitarian sector was for. Now it's taken on just a much bigger role. I think of a country like Afghanistan, where essentially the humanitarian sector is in a position where it is doing the entire bulk of the aid. They're doing things that are not very emergency aid, but because of the way that the funding is right now with donor restrictions and since the Taliban takeover, that they find themselves really doing more than was ever intended for emergency aid to address, because of the situation that Afghanistan is in, and with the restrictions on funding and sanctions and all that. And I think the scope of what the humanitarian sector aims to do is as big as it's ever been. And I think there's already self-reflection on this. There always is in the humanitarian sector, but I think that will continue to be the case, especially when we're talking about, no one believes that there's going to be enough money to fund humanitarian crises the way the system is currently built. So what can it's one thing to find the money. It's another thing to reduce the needs, and we can talk about that later. But it's another thing also to maybe think about how to limit what the humanitarian sector can and cannot do, and just be realistic about that, and to have that discussion. And working this back to the ICRC, I think that will come down the line as well. There's, the ICRC, like the wider humanitarian sector, has really expanded its scope of what it does. It has climate change programs now. It has research programs. It's a lot more than what it just, the basics of what it used to be. So I think in the coming months and years, there's going to be more reflection within the organization of what its scope should be. Does it need to scale back? Does it need to concentrate on what it does really well? And that's going to be, I think, a lot of hard conversations within the organization. And those sorts of conversations will also be held across the humanitarian sector.
Mm. So what you mean is it's become a lot more than, shelter and meals after a disaster, which is kind of the old school picture of humanitarian aid that probably people outside the sector would have.
Exactly.
And yeah, and so the more you try to do, the more expensive it gets.
Yes, and it's not, it's not saying that people need to go back to just shelter and food and things like that. There's a lot of reasons why that's a very simplistic shelter and food. That's
Mm.
not what people want. The reason why it has expanded, or one of the reasons, is that because people in crises do not, generally speaking, they're not looking for. If you were to ask a preference, people in crises, I think, would not be looking for shelter. They're looking for land. They're not looking for food. They're looking for crops to grow or for a sustainable system. They're not looking for a handout. They're looking for a job. No one wants to be on aid their entire life, and so to recognize this as the emergency aid sector has to lean into things that approach longer term um, services, or what are they doing, if they're actually responding to people's needs. So it's not purely a question of, well, should or should they not be doing this, but there's a natural reason why they've leaned into programs beyond what you would think of as immediate life-saving care. But it does raise these questions when we're talking about billions in unfunded emergency response plans.
Mm. It's interesting because what you're pointing to, land rather than shelter, or jobs rather than a head house, those are, structural issues that in a way are require more than an NGO, more than the ICRC, more than even the UN to make happen, right? It's very structural and long term, and in a way much more complicated.
Right, and again, that's not you're not going the humanitarian sector is not going to solve those sorts of issues. It's government, it's governance, it's resilience, that's the international financial sector, that's local communities. Um, but it does feel like the over the years it's grown to where the humanitarian sector feels like it has to have the answer to some of these problems, because in some cases they're the ones who have the money, they're the ones with the presence and the funding. And now that crises are compounding with climate change and longer term conflicts, conflicts without end, longer term crises, drought, food security crises that go on for years, that it just seems like it's all compounding. And so, it's sort of exacerbating these issues and forcing, I think, the humanitarian sector to face these questions at some point.
Mm. So, for people who are just joining us, just to recap, we are with Irwin Loy, our policy editor at the New Humanitarian, here to talk about money and funding in the aid sector. Please go ahead and put your questions in the comments. It's lovely to see people joining from all over the world, and a number of you are mentioning that you are in the humanitarian aid industry yourselves. And so, if you have questions for Irwin on this or on other things that he's written, go ahead and drop them in the comments, and I'll make sure to put them to him. So we talked about the growing need, and the other side of the equation is donors, and the funding that's coming in. So how come they're not able to give nearly as much as is needed? Is it a case that donors are backing out of their commitments, that there are other priorities? I know certainly living in the UK that foreign aid is not a popular budget with our current government, or are there other issues at play?
I mean, it's all those things are true, and it's more than that. But it's also, yeah, donor funding it does keep rising. It's not that it's disappeared. It's just that the humanitarian needs and the costs of responding to those needs are really outpacing what donors are providing. Um, and so, in pure dollar terms, donor funding does rise a little bit each year, just not keeping pace. Um, it's the same small pool of donors that fund the humanitarian sector that has been for the last couple of decades or more. Generally speaking, global North, Western, North American, European, Australia, Japan. They're some of the biggest funders. So I think the aid sector, the humanitarians, anyways, like to talk about, well, how can we expand that donor pool? How can we push new donors to come on board? And so that's a frequent topic of conversation. Last week I was in Brussels for the European Humanitarian Forum, and that was one of the panels too. Was um, talking about new donors, new ways of funding humanitarian aid, and I don't think anyone in the room thought any of it was new. In fact, many of the panelists were like, "No, this is not new. People have been talking about finding new donors for ages, and it just hasn't come through in a consistent way." I think the problem with um, there are certainly countries that do not pull their weight in the way that Western countries see their contributions. Um, I don't know at this stage how realistic it is to expect the same amount of contributions, and it does seem to me like it's part of the same problem. Um, Western aid is politicized, so will the aid from new donors. It will go to the crises or countries where they have political interests, generally speaking, and that's not going to change with some new donors. But obviously, any amount will be helpful for the humanitarian sector. But I don't think it's not a silver bullet,
Mhm.
and I don't think it ever will be. So there's talk of Jan Egeland from NRC talked about putting pressure on some of these countries, basically saying without saying China, countries that hold Olympics and put satellites in space, to fund more humanitarian aid. Um, and I think some of these countries will say, well, we do our own thing. What they're not doing is necessarily funding the big UN appeals to the same degree that European and other Western nations do. Um, but I think there is this assumption that um, these UN appeals and humanitarian aid are a Western thing, quote unquote. Um, and so I think it's there can be some level of engagement, but I think it's unrealistic to expect at this stage full buy-in on that. So looking for new or emerging donors, there's a limit to how far that can go. Um,
Is there, even if they weren't to go through the UN system, could there be kind of another external parallel system? I mean, obviously, when we say other new countries, emerging donors, I mean, China is the massive economy that isn't really contributing in a meaningful way. So, could there be another mechanism that they, or is it more of a philosophical opposition to participating in such aid?
well, I think when you say contributing in a meaningful way, I think they're not contributing in the same way to these sort of UN-led appeals, which are
Mm.
seen, I think, outside of the West as a product of the West. It's not as international, quote unquote, as the international community likes to think when
Mm.
the system is dominated by Western nations. So I think it's unrealistic to expect countries that will not have an equal say in the politics of aid to contribute in an equal way to something they don't believe is truly global. Um, and but there are other ways that they can and do contribute. Um, it's just perhaps more criticized. China has its own objectives with its aid, as do Western nations, and it does do bilateral humanitarian aid, disaster response, and certainly there's been a lot of discussion about the broader financial aid, quote unquote, uh, loans with strings on them for perhaps more development projects or things like that. It does do humanitarian aid as well after disasters, and it does. It is interesting to see some of the social media messaging that comes out of China about its aid after the earthquakes in Syria and Turkey. There were a lot of messages on social media about some of the aid that it was doing. Um, and some of the messages were like, "Oh, well, Western countries aren't doing this, and look how much we're doing," and which is an interesting form of messaging because it's not quite true. Lots of countries were doing that sort of basic, or trying to do that sort of the early days, recovery, disaster response, search and rescue, that kind of thing. And China's contributions weren't huge compared to what else was going on. But it's interesting the sort of messaging that comes out, saying, okay, actually, we are doing something. So I don't know who that audience was targeted to, but these messages were in English. So just something I noticed. But
A
yes,
reminder that as much as humanitarians are generally attached to a principle of impartiality, the governments that fund it certainly do have a message that they want to.
exactly. And I mean, and international aid groups also have that message too. I found it interesting that these messages were coming promoting Chinese aid, but also how many ads do we see that are exactly the same for individual aid organizations? We're just used to it as a thing that happens,
Yeah.
as a fundraising thing, but Western governments insist on their stickers being plastered all over any sort of shipment. And that's, everyone knows that's a thing. People joke about it. There are budget lines for it.
Yeah, from the people of the United States or from the people of the UK on all the
Exactly.
boxes. Yeah, absolutely. And the tents with the logos, the big logos.
Yeah, lots of logos.
We have a question. We're gonna veer sideways a little bit, but I just want to take the opportunity to take questions from the audience. So if you have them, go ahead and drop them in. Mohammed, who's joining us from Mauritania, is asking, what about a new strategy for humanitarian aid after COVID-19? Is that going to change? So it's a pretty broad question, but has COVID-19 kind of been a break in how humanitarian aid is being funded or delivered?
I think there's like a range of. I don't think there's a simple answer to that question, but there's a range of things that are being done differently because of COVID. Um, I think COVID exposed the um, where health systems fail. That's where emergency aid is needed. And I just think back to the early days of COVID, where the humanitarian sector was not really sure about how to be involved, because before it was declared a pandemic, before um, COVID became what we know, the humanitarians I was talking to were still a bit unsure about what their involvement was. It was affecting countries, it was affecting health systems, it was not yet affecting refugee camps. It was not yet affecting the people that they worked with. Of course, now we know that yes, it probably was. We just didn't have the health systems in place to detect it early on, because that is usually the product of local governments, national governments, and as we all know, generally people in crises tend to be at the bottom of the list for prioritization of health needs. So, I think COVID exposed those sorts of gaps and also underscored the importance of these sort of social protection schemes and making sure that that all people are protected, the importance of health equity. Now, how that relates to the humanitarian sector is, I think going back to our earlier points, is like it's not something the humanitarian sector alone can do. The emergency aid is not going to replace a health system, and in cases where it does, that's not a very long-term viable solution, especially given how much health systems cost. So yeah, I don't know. I think I'm not really answering the question here. But like, I
No,
think
I
it's
think you are.
I think it's sort of showing like again, underscoring like that it's not, humanitarian aid cannot be responsible for solving all the world's problems. Humanitarian aid is a band-aid for 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 the world's problems, and but I think people in the sector tend to view it as you know the solution, but it's increasingly clear that it can't be the only solution.
Well, because I can only imagine if you're working in it all day and for years, and you're seeing the problems and you're seeing the causes, you probably are very tempted to just kind of walk up that hill and find, take problems at the source. But that's also where perhaps they don't have all of the levers to be able to really create that change that they want to see ahead of the problem. Since we were talking about donors and funding, which is our primary topic, even though we strayed a little bit, I'm curious about the private sector, right? Because that's where the money is these days, and that's where you have incredible power as well in society. So how is the private sector getting involved? And can they plug that funding hole in any meaningful way?
Um, the private sector is getting involved, and there is a push for it to scale up. The problem is it's on a fairly relatively small level to some degree, or um, isolated. It's not scaled up, and that's where the potential is. Part of the um, I think there's a push within the aid sector, to the humanitarian aid sector, to really include the private sector more and figure out ways of doing it, and to mainstream that, quote unquote, in the way that humanitarian funding works. I still see a bit of a problem in that, not necessarily among people, among humanitarians who work on this file, but more generally among humanitarians who think that the private sector is going to be filling the funding gap of the existing humanitarian responses. I don't think that's what the private sector wants to do. I don't think that's what development actors or international funders like the World Bank want to do. And I think if people keep thinking of it that way, the private sector is not going to step up to fund the system as it is now. And I think it's more about using the skills in the private sector to scale things up that do work. But that's not really funding humanitarian response. It's not going from, okay, we didn't get enough money from the United States or Germany, our biggest donors, so now we're going to turn to the private sector. On some small scales, yes, but they're not going to be topping up this 50%, billions that are missing in humanitarian response. It's more about using, private foundations, using their leverage to, for example, de-risk projects that might be beneficial to local communities where, for example, communities in crises where it's difficult to fund infrastructure. The private sector can step in there, perhaps, and make these projects a little bit more viable. There's a whole host of other ways that the private sector can be involved. It doesn't necessarily involve just being another new funder. So yeah, I think it's a really interesting area of focus for the future, or the present day, but not as just to replace or top up funding. I think that's not really what the private sector is there for.
Mm. And of course, when we talk about private sector involvement, and again, going back to those structural issues we were talking about earlier and trying to prevent the crisis as much as possible rather than putting a band-aid over it, there's a lot of talk of, well, how can the private sector essentially just behave better and do the things the private sector is supposed to do, but in a way that is fairer and to various countries and helps build resilience, so that people can, or countries can, handle humanitarian crises on their own.
Yeah, I mean, I think on a local level, the private sector is just as with any local organization, volunteer groups, they are already active. They don't need a separate branch of humanitarianism to recognize them to be active. And I think at the local level, private businesses are already part of the solution. It's just more perhaps the bigger, when you're talking about the international picture of how aid works. Um, I don't think it's so realistic for them to be expected, the private sector, quote unquote, to be expected to kind of swoop in and save everything with bundles of cash, because that's just not going to
Yeah,
happen.
yeah, no. I guess what I was referring to is this idea of trade rather than aid, or how trade can contribute. Which, by the way, is my opportunity to plug our podcast, which had a wonderful episode about this. So look for the New Humanitarian on your podcast platforms, and there's a great conversation on that topic. So again, if you have questions in the audience, please drop them in the comments. We're about to close this out, but we'll take the last few questions from the audience if you have any. And Irwin, my last question is, I feel like, and we were talking about this yesterday when we were preparing this, talk of the need to reform, transform aid, and the scope of aid and how it's funded is not particularly new. And you've been covering this much longer. I'm just dropping a toe in for the last few months, but are you, how, with the time that you spend covering this, how are you seeing this, and are you hopeful that this is more than talk, and that there is sufficient change and transformation on the horizon, or is this a lot of talk?
I think it can be both. It is a lot of talk, but that's not new in the humanitarian sector. All these things that we've talked about and more of, people in the sector have been talking about for years. I think what's different is that there's, just the numbers alone. The money can't keep up no matter where it comes from. And so I think there's more discussion about reducing needs, especially with climate change. And again, that goes back to, well, that's not the solution to that is not a humanitarian issue. So there's maybe more room for advocacy and things like that. But when you're talking about we talked about, like, the different ingredients with the funding gap, and that's obviously funding. And the other side is, well, why are the needs so high in the first place? So how do you reduce those needs? So, the levers that the humanitarian sector has are pretty nascent. We have, anticipatory action, which is all about trying to anticipate crises before, or responses to crises before they get out of control, and that can reduce what the cost would be, and obviously, more importantly, what the severity of the humanitarian needs. But even that, which sounds pretty basic, is, in many cases in the pilot phase for a specific project, working out what the triggers are to distribute funding for certain emergencies, things like that. On a bigger level, when we're talking about reducing needs, we're talking about making communities more resilient. We're talking about disaster risk reduction. We're talking about climate change adaptation. We're talking about equity, equality, and governance. Those are not humanitarian issues. Those are not humanitarian solutions per se, at least for the humanitarian sector. So those sorts of discussions, I think, humanitarian groups are having those discussions about what they contributed, what they can contribute, if anything. And I think climate change is a good example of this, where in the last couple of years, and definitely within the last year, there's been a bit of a shift in how humanitarians view their relation to climate change and climate advocacy. Everyone knows that climate change is a humanitarian issue. And I think a few years ago, it felt like humanitarians were like finally realizing, okay, well, we should start saying that more clearly. They thought it was obvious, and it was, but and now it's what sort of message do you bring to summits like COP, like the climate change summit, and we see more humanitarian groups there each year, and there's going to be a stronger presence this year, I imagine. And I know right now there are discussions at senior levels about exactly what message do they bring, and what do they talk about. And some of the big points are about climate financing and getting that money to crisis areas where it's just not going right now. So I think those discussions are ongoing. And so I think to go back to your question, it is a lot of talk, but I think with climate change and with just the sheer numbers, it's going to force a little more serious discussion of some of these reform proposals and reform commitments that have been committed to over the last few years. And that doesn't mean that it will change, but I think there's going to be clearly more emphasis on talking about why it's not changed.
We're getting a few questions from the audience, actually, who are starting to come in with their questions. So I'll just throw them to you quick fire. First, we have Stephanie asking about what about individual contributions? Now, of course, when we're talking about a funding gap of billions, individual seems pretty small, but we see individual. Obviously donations, but also right with the, we've seen, I've seen, friends drive vans full of stuff to the Ukraine border, and with the earthquakes in Turkey, we saw, just private individuals, driving from Istanbul, driving from Ankara, and with supplies and trying to do what they can. So what's the role of the individual there?
Oh, certainly significant. I think we all know that local responses are the first to happen, and they don't really get the time in the limelight, and they're often sort of ignored by the official, professional international aid sector.
Ignored, if not even discouraged, as in they're getting in the way, or
Yeah, exactly.
they don't know what they're doing, or
and there are reasons for that, but it's also unrealistic to say, okay, well, don't get involved, because it's going to happen. So why not leverage that? And there's people are trying to do that, but I think when we talk about humanitarian response to a given crisis, it's hard to quantify the value of these individual contributions and volunteer groups and whatnot, and so they're often just not factored in that way. But yeah, certainly, as you mentioned, Ukraine, the earthquakes, invaluable contributions from individuals, and many organizations essentially depend on individual contributions. And I think maybe when the problem is when we're talking about scale and the reliability of what organizations need to survive over the long term, and plan multi-year programs. Individual contributions alone, it can be a bit, perhaps not dependable in that way. But certainly right now, I think with Ukraine, I think individual donations are giving Ukrainian groups more leverage than they have had under the international aid sector. And we'll have a story touching on that in the next couple of weeks, let's say. And yeah, so, obviously an important part of how humanitarianism works, even if it's not always acknowledged.
Well, okay, so everyone look out for that story. That's at thenewhumanitarian.org. And I just wanted also just to note the power of diaspora in this, which we often forget, but the work of Ukrainians abroad, or certainly I see in London the Turkish community very involved in gathering donations. We have another question from Mike. If donor money is still growing, then why have they told ICRC that there will be cuts? Is the money going to different places, and if so, where?
Donor money is growing in marginally in strict dollar amounts when I'm talking about like the overall counts of what is coming from traditional donors towards humanitarian aid. In terms of ICRC, I think that's an indication of how the ICRC manages its budget and how it plans for the coming year. It made the ICRC made its current year budget and approved it. I forget the exact date, but let's say early on in 2023, or at least that's when they publicly launched it. And that was based on promises that they had or assumptions that they had. And their system, the way their system works is they plan for it, and then they raise the money with assuming that they can get all the money. And obviously that's not the case this time around. In terms of where it's going instead, I don't have that. I don't know. In terms of like what's been the promises to the ICRC that have been that they've been told that they won't receive from individual donors. I don't know where that's going specifically. I'm not sure if that's a specific thing, but generally speaking, we all know that there are many underfunded crises around the world. And in the last year, Ukraine was one of the crises where really there was a lot of funding. It was not evenly distributed. It was not really going to Ukrainian responders. But I think that's where in other crises people were struggling to find the funds. And in Ukraine, it was a slightly different story last year and this year. So but in terms of like where this budget line went, did it go from here to this specific crisis? I don't know.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Irwin. That's our time for today, unless we get a very last minute question from the audience. But thank you everyone for joining. If you are joining us on YouTube, make sure to subscribe to the channel, hit the bell so you can be notified of future live streams. We're trying to do this regularly with our whole newsroom and bring you a little bit more in-depth conversations on our most vital and current coverage. If you're following on LinkedIn, similarly, go ahead and hit the follow button. If you're one of my followers who's joined the stream or one of Irwin's, make sure to follow the New Humanitarian page, which will drop in the comments so that you can be aware of future conversation, and also just follow our coverage, which you can also read at thenewhumanitarian.org, where you can sign up for newsletters and listen to the podcast. That's it. That's all of the plugs for today. Thank you, everyone, for joining. Thank you, Mike. Mike says, thank you. This was excellent. Just passing it on, Irwin. Thank you for all of your expertise. And please join us for future live streams as well. Thank you. Thank you, Irwin.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Bye.